One of the great challenges in doing communication research is that in most situations, we're not able to study every single person that we are interested in. And instead, we only end up studying a subset. So, to give you some examples of this, let's say that you are working for a PR firm, and that PR firm wants to do a survey of all of its employees. So, this would be an internal in-house survey to find out how satisfied they are with their jobs and if there's anything the firm can do to make them happier or more satisfied. Now, in that situation, it wouldn't be too difficult to administer that survey to every single person you're interested in, every employee of the firm. You could send out a mass email to all employees and include in that email a link to an online survey. Or if you wanted to do the survey on paper or in person, there's probably a master list of all of the employees of the firm, and you could just go down the list, make sure that each one of them gets a copy of the survey. Okay? But usually it's not quite that cut and dry. Let's say, for example, that you are working for a nonprofit organization that works on behalf of, or that works with issues related to animal welfare and animal rights. And let's say that that organization wants to better understand how it can serve its audience. So it wants to do some kind of a survey of all animal lovers in the area. Let's say all the animal lovers in South Central Pennsylvania. Well, now you can understand why things get more challenging, right? Because there is no master list of all animal lovers in South Central Pennsylvania. There is no easy way that you could administer that survey to everybody in South Central PA who loves animals. So you'd have to get a little more creative in figuring out who you're going to give the survey to. You might say, well, I'll go to one of the local animal shelters, because animal lovers will show up at an animal shelter wanting to adopt pets. I'll have the animal shelter pass out that survey to people who come in to the animal shelter. And, let's see, there's a Facebook group for dog lovers in South Central PA. I'll post a little message on that Facebook group with a link to the survey, inviting people to click the link and take the survey. So you come up with a way to reach animal lovers, but you're not going to reach all of the people that you're actually interested in. You're going to end up with only a subset of animal lovers. And as a result, your findings, your conclusions may be somewhat skewed, may be somewhat biased based on the sample that you selected. Now, some people say, as a result, they're like, well, okay, we should just ignore all research, because how can you possibly know what the opinions of Americans are if you only surveyed 1,000 of them? So there are some people who just don't trust research at all. And then there are the people who blindly trust everything. And I think what we want to aim for is somewhere in between. The truth is, you can get away with a fairly small sample as long as you are very careful in selecting that sample, and as long as you have some confidence that that sample is representative of the overall population of interest. So let's talk about the term sample and population and what they mean for researchers. So the population is all of the people with the characteristics that you, the researcher, wish to study. So if, for example, you want to know whether undergraduate college students prefer in-person learning or online learning, okay? Your population would be all undergraduate college students. And of course, it would be difficult to actually survey or interview all of them. So that gives you an example of what we mean by the population. If you wanted to do some kind of a study looking at which features of Facebook users find most useful, your population would be all Facebook users. But remember, in most situations, we're not able to study the entire population, so we are forced to only draw a sample. And the sample is that subset that the researcher actually studies. So maybe rather than surveying all undergraduate students, you end up only surveying 1,000 undergraduate students at 2 particular universities. Or instead of studying all Facebook users, maybe you only study Facebook users belonging to certain Facebook groups. Okay. So the sample is that subset. Now, as soon as you make the decision to only examine a sample, that automatically means that your results, the results of your study, are going to be somewhat, emphasize the word somewhat, suspect, because you didn't actually study everyone you're interested in. You know, when pollsters do political polls, one poll may show that, you know, this candidate is ahead by 2 points, and another poll may show that that candidate is ahead by 4 points. Why the difference is? Well, it's because none of those polls looked at everybody. None of them looked at the full population. They only studied a sample. So when you only study a sample, that means there is always going to be a certain amount of sampling error baked into your research. The word error makes it sound like you did something terrible, right? Like there was a mistake. It's not a mistake. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means that there's always going to be a certain amount of wiggle room when you decide to only study a sample. That's why political polls, for example, will report their margin of error. There's going to be a margin of error because of the fact that they only studied a sample. So when you are figuring out what your sampling strategy is going to be, and that's one of the most important decisions that a researcher has to make because it's going to affect the whole rest of the study, there are 2 broad categories of sampling: probability and non-probability. So let's start with probability samples. Those are samples that use random selection to draw the sample. So if it's random selection, that means each person or item in your population should, at least in theory, have an equal chance of being selected. Think about something like a lottery, for example, right? In a lottery, everybody's name goes into the big drum, and then they pull the names out randomly so that every person who entered the lottery has an equal chance of being the winner. That's probability sampling. Probability sampling is great, but it's often difficult to pull off. And so in many situations, we end up using non-probability samples instead. Non-probability samples do not rely on random selection. Instead, the researcher makes a conscious decision about which people or which items to sample. The example I gave you of the animal welfare nonprofit organization that decides to administer their survey to people at an animal shelter or people who belong to an animal lovers Facebook group, okay? That's an example where the researcher, the person doing the survey, made a conscious decision as far as which people to include or exclude from the study. That's a non-probability sample when the researcher's judgment comes into play. Now, those 2 types of samples, which type do you suppose allows us to make generalizations? In other words, make broader conclusions about the population based on what we have found to be true in the sample. Which type allows us to make that sort of leap, that inferential leap from the sample to the population, make broader conclusions, what we would call generalizations? The answer is probability samples. Because when you use a probability sample, and each person has an equal chance of being chosen for the sample, you should, in theory, end up with a sample that is representative of the overall population, so that you can make that conclusion, that generalization. Whereas non-probability samples don't allow us to make that kind of leap. So that's one of the limitations of a non-probability sample. You can say an awful lot about what you found to be true among the sample, but you have to be really careful in trying to generalize those results to the overall population, because you have no assurance that your sample was representative of the overall population. So of the 2 types, only the probability samples allow us to make those kinds of generalizations. In the next couple of videos, I want to talk about specific types of probability samples and specific types of non-probability samples.